Hello and welcome back to the Prospect Podcast. I'm Ellen Halliday.
And I'm Alona Ferber.
And today we're excited to be joined once again by our contributing editor, Tom Clark, to talk about the Prime Minister Keir Starmer's apparent strategy in recent weeks and what it tells us about who Labour is currently interested in appealing to. Tom, it's really good to see you. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. And I hope you're doing well in these terrifying times.
Strange times. Yes, the headlines are seeping into our brains. And we were talking this morning about Elon Musk and Donald Trump playing on our subconscious. So that's never a good sign. But we're here today to talk about the UK and Labour. And let's get straight into the question of what we can glean from the government's recent actions, policies, statements about its plan and its strategy. And I wonder how you think Starmer's government is sizing up against its previously stated goals.
So, there's one thing that I think is, anyone listening to the Prospect podcast will be familiar with, which is that Keir Starmer ran to be Labour leader as a unity candidate, someone who was going to bring different factions of progressive, centre-left, whatever you want to call it, opinion together and build a broad tent. And he made 10 sort of vaguely socialist promises about nationalising things and bringing water back into public ownership and increasing taxes for higher income people. And those got buried. Some of it was buried because things got less affordable after COVID, but really it was a classic thing that politicians do in Britain and America and around the world, which is they suck up to their base in order to get in charge and have a run at the general public. And then they move to the centre afterwards. And so what Starmer did there was just a kind of special case of a general phenomenon. But what struck me about the last couple of weeks is the way in which he seems to be disowning not only like some of the pledges he made to kind of pull Labour out of the Corbyn thing, but disown some things that were strongly associated with him personally in the recent past, in terms of like making sure that any growth that you have is green growth and really going for that aspect of it in terms of being associated with disruptive legal challenges, which is how he made his name. So the libel people standing up to corporate power, and his job was unpaid most of the time to make sure that these slightly misfitty people who are giving out leaflets about how awful McDonald's was in McDonald's got a fair hearing. And in the last kind of week, we've had this idea that we're going for growth and we're going to damn everything else. We're going to get rid of the competition regulator for being too keen on competition, with the corollary that maybe that might leave consumers getting ripped off. So in other words, we're more interested in business and investment than we are in a fair deal for consumers. That we're going to build a big runway at Heathrow, probably the single announcement that people will have been aware of. I'm going to build this bigger airport. So that doesn't sound like very green growth. There's other things that are around about maybe deregulating the banks a little bit, despite the fact that, within all of our political memories, that caused complete chaos. So it feels like there's an abandonment of Starmer's personal heritage, and it feels like there is an abandonment of the wisdom that you might have got out of the last 15 years since the banks went bust the last time round.
So you wrote for us recently a great piece about how Keir Starmer is kind of governing against his younger self. You mentioned just now this iconic McLibel trial in the 90s. Starmer was a dashing, young, campaigning lawyer working pro bono to protect these activists against major corporate interests. And that seems so different, you argue in your piece, to the elder Starmer as Prime Minister. What do you think that young Starmer would have made of the party that his elder version of himself has created?
I think it's pretty hard to think he would have been cheerful at the moment. He would see, because I'm sure he was always quite a kind of nuanced thinker, if you like. He'd see that the Prime Minister's trying to do a lot of very difficult things. He's trying to kind of keep together the coalition that did well for him at the general election. He'd see that, like, we're not going to be able to fix all the public services unless we get some economic growth. So you need to find a way of doing that. So he would have seen all of that, and he'd have seen the fact that, it's better than not that the government has put up taxes on national insurance in order to rescue the public services. But still, I think he would have thought it was a thoroughly depressing spectacle to watch this government looking quite awkward, as well as the things I've mentioned. A thing dear to Prospect's heart is we've just had Prince Harry find that News Corp, the Murdoch empire, in other words, has now been forced by the Prince to admit to lots of wrongdoing that it denied up until now. People like Keir Starmer and Ed Miliband, a few years ago were kind of getting the bit between their teeth on that, but now Keir Starmer is looking away. So I think that the younger Keir Starmer, who when you see him interviewed, talks about the importance of standing up to the powerful, ensuring everyone has a voice, would say that the older Keir Starmer appears to have an ear for voices that are already powerful, and you'd find that disturbing.
You argue in your piece that this is kind of politically problematic. A lot of people reading your piece were like, well, obviously, as you get older, you become less idealistic and more conservative. But your point is, it's not just about that. It's a political problem for the Labour Party ahead of the next election. What's so dangerous here for Labour?
So here I think we need to take a step back. Politicians and lobby journalists are always obsessed, understandably, because it's the game. Like, what matters in football, if you're a football commentator, is goals, and what matters in politics is who wins how many seats. But when you're a bit further away from Westminster, you look, for example, at how many people bother to get out of bed and vote Labour. That isn't the only thing that matters, but it's something. In 2017, Labour lost the election, but Jeremy Corbyn got 13 million votes. In 2019, the famous worst election in Labour's history, Jeremy Corbyn lost the election badly, but he got 10.3 million votes. In 2024, Keir Starmer won the election handsomely and got 9.7 million votes. Okay, now I don't think the Westminster Village, if we want to call it that, and I'm in Yorkshire, I'm talking to you, you're in Westminster, but I don't think that they've really got their heads around that. It has to sort of matter that they only got 9.7 million votes, 34% of the ballot, even though they got this handsome majority because the Conservatives collapsed far, far more. So they are starting from a very narrow mandate in the country, even though they've got this crushing majority in the House of Commons. And, the inevitable corollary of that arithmetic is that they were very good at targeting the right bits of the political map, in particular, the kind of older pro-Brexit towns where there are lots of swing voters, and they got enough of them on board, even if they lost, the students and the kind of Green campaigners and the rest of it in other places. And that turned out to matter. But the corollary of it is that there's a lot of Labour MPs, huge number of them, but sitting on relatively narrow margins. And so when you're on 34% and your vote is spread quite thinly, if very effectively last time, things could change quite a lot if it goes the wrong way. And now that we're starting to see polls with, Nigel Farage potentially overtaking Labour, we really need to give that some thought, I think, and Labour rather should give that some thought and think about not just which parts of the map it's changing, but increasing its or broadening its aggregate appeal.
Yeah, I mean, since that last election, when, as you say, Labour had a lower overall number of votes, people didn't turn out with great enthusiasm for Labour, even though they won a lot of seats. I mean, since then, the polls have changed quite a lot. The trend is very much one of reform in ascendance, and Labour has kind of stalled. There's new polls out today, and one number doesn't tell us that much, but it's part of a broader picture in which reform is neck and neck with Labour. In this latest poll, reform has actually overtaken. It's on 25% voting intention, Labour 24, and the Tories 21. So there's clearly a struggle here, and Labour, despite being in government, haven't really been able to capitalise on that. I mean, what do you make of these kind of polls as we head into what are local elections in England and Wales in May, how do you think Labour strategy is kind of paying off?
Well, this is where I start to get really worried, because I think if people like just look at that and run it through a kind of swingometer and say, well, actually, because the Tories are even more on the floor and they're going to get 22%, Nigel Farage is going to get 24 and we're going to get 24. And the way that this works with all the swings and everything is, oh, look, we might have a majority of 20 on a majority of 24 and then we'll get some growth. So we'll go up to 26 and happy days. You know, it's not going to be happy days at all. I think already we're seeing some consequences in terms of like how sour the country is, because of the narrowness of the margin in the country as opposed to the margin in Westminster. And, you know, you might possibly be able to squeak a majority on an even lower vote share, but it would kind of, you know, politics doesn't stop at the House of Commons. The fact that most of the country's against you is dangerous, and particularly if a large part of the country is rallying to what increasingly I think you can say with reform is a kind of far right force. And I also think that this style of campaigning, or rather not campaigning, means that you're not confronting any of reform's arguments. Now, you know, Keir Starmer would say, and he's right, he came in, he cancelled the Rwanda scheme on day one. He's being much more pragmatic in saying that he'll go after the gangs instead. That's a kind of shift from posturing to delivery. But if you look at Trump, and I don't think we should look at Trump too much because it's another country and in anyone narrowly and we're in danger of overinterpreting it. But like, he had a kind of clear, punchy, simple message where he was saying, I'm going to do this because I don't like these people and we're going to take them on, you know, whoever it is, the environmentalist or the DEI brigade or whatever. Whereas when Keir Starmer wants to make a stand on something, let's say he wants to stop selling some arms to Israel, you know, have tens of thousands of people are dead, and like, he doesn't say we're going to stop doing it. He says we're going to stop selling some arms to Israel because we're legally obliged to. It sounds like a bureaucrat, dare I say, the director of public prosecutions, reluctantly following a procedural point rather than ever making a stand. Now, even the people who are keen on the Starmer operation, I think, are worried about this lack of fight. Because if we look at people that, like, you know, progressive sort of centre-left figures of the past, like Attlee, great, he looked like a bank manager, he was boring, but he took on fights. He said he was building a social commonwealth of Britain. Or Roosevelt, you know, he was a great pragmatist. He did terrible deals with racists, much more racist, you know, than much grubbier deals in a way than anything Starmer's done. But he also said we're going to drive the money lenders out of the temple, and made enemies of big businesses and big banks and all the rest of it, and had a bit of fight so that people could see what they were getting. There was a bit of energy to it. And I mean, my worry at the moment is no one can really see what they're getting at all. I mean, even on Europe, right? We've had Europe suggesting various things. When I wrote the piece, I said, you know, the people that they've tried to win, the kind of flag-waving Brexit brigade, who we now know are a smaller, dwindling minority of the election, they've got a kind of veto on sensible pragmatism with Europe. In the last few days, that's changed, and Starmer's saying, oh, well, maybe we'll actually do some kind of deal. But there's been no preparing of the ground for this thing about a new customs union. All we've heard is we need to hang on to our precious Brexit freedoms, which it kind of comes down to the character thing. I think most voters sort of know that a lot of the time Starmer isn't saying what he really believes, and that gets a bit tricky.
I mean, do you think you sort of identified a problem of style as much as kind of substance there? But I mean, which do you think is more problematic? Because you've also talked about the real changes, like, you know, about faces on key policy issues. So that's a substance problem, whether Labour actually goes for green growth or growth, you know, without much regard for climate targets. But then you've also talked there about kind of the delivery issue, which is more of an issue, do you think, for Labour?
I think it's quite hard to weight their relative significance. I mean, in the sense that, you know, if you care about the environment, you will care about building Heathrow, because nobody really believes that we can build Heathrow and another airport they're building up here in the north, like that we can hit the climate targets, or at least that the government has a plan by which it knows we can hit those targets while building more and more airports. And I think people know that in the end, if we want growth, it might be a good idea to have closer alignment with Europe. So we need to get on with it. I think that people know that in the end, like saying let's deregulate the banks didn't end well last time, and it probably won't end well this time. And where does if we're going to do growth and not worry about anything else, where does that take you? Do we end up like Tony Blair saying we're going to do a super casino in deprived Blackpool because that's a way of like bringing in quotes industry? I mean, or should we legalize crack in Blackpool, and because that's a way of bringing in a different industry? Like you don't need to be any kind of radical to see that if you're just saying let's increase the number of transactions measured in GDP statistics, that's going to end badly in the end, because there's all kinds of spillovers and things that go wrong, as I'm sure Keir Starmer knows and would accept. But like, I worry that in this drive for growth, which what matters in the substance that matters in the short term is getting 2 or 3% growth a year in the second half of this parliament, and there could be things like deregulating gambling or building Heathrow and all the rest of it that will get you that in 2 or 3 years' time and then cause trouble in 10 years' time. So I worry about that on the substance. But on the politics, I worry about looking shifty, not knowing what you're standing for, and people just being quite confused. If things were looking really great, if we could say, if the growth is really strong, if people are seeing their wages rise, if NHS waiting lists are coming down, if people are seeing that local facilities they've got in their local communities that have been closing for the last 15 years stop shutting down and maybe even start opening up again, then I think you could be pretty boring and not have a big story, and like lived experience would be your trump card. But I don't think even the people in the government believe that's going to happen in the next few years. And it's not their fault entirely, because there's too many pressures. There's pressures on debt interest repayment. There's pressures on the army when it comes to Russia. So, when it's all a bit mushy and things are going to be a bit kind of like grudging, the reality is going to be grudge-inducing at best, then you need a clear story, and I'm not sure they've got one.
So, Tom, you talked a lot there about kind of the challenges for the economy. There are things that are out of Labour's control. But there's something about like the very idea that kind of the way to convince everybody, the big message has to be growth. Is there a problem with that in the first place? It's very difficult to make that a compelling message that means things to people when growth is something that will happen later, after, for example, the difficult choices and sacrifices we'll have to make, as Starmer and Reeves have been telling us, since they won the election. What is there something about like the actual strategy of like pushing this idea of big growth without making it more specific for people about the impact in their life? It's very difficult to make that an appealing message.
Yeah, and I'm sure that the better communicators in the government, of whom there are some, will be saying what we need to do is get this onto rising wages, and if you get growth, maybe there'll be rising wages too, and that's kind of fine if if it happens, and B, they do need to start talking about that. At the moment, as it happens, earnings are going up for the first time in a long while. But in terms of keeping a sort of centre-left coalition and animated Labour Party, worrying about that flank of people that might deflect to the Greens or might deflect to the kind of new Jeremy Corbyn thing, whatever it's called, they need a message with some politics on it. Tony Blair was much more, by the end, wasn't in any sense left wing, but he still had to do things that were for his party, banning fox hunting. He didn't want to do it, but he let it go through because it's kind of something to remind Labour members why they're in it. They prefer this growth thing at the moment, partly because, it's needed because growth's been pathetic for a long time, but partly because it avoids having to admit that you're going to have to make decisions in which some people will be better off and some people will be worse off. But we got that through the election campaign, didn't we, where Starmer said, I'm not going to be like other Labour leaders. I'm not going to reach for the tax lever, as well as all the specific pledges on the... And then, of course, they get in and they have to do a huge tax increase. it feels more like an evasion now because it's already proved to be an evasion once. That's with the general public. And then with the sort of post-materialistic kind of, younger idealistic bloc or baby boomer idealistic bloc, people who might be tempted by the Greens or the Lib Dems or whatever, I think the idea of growth for its own sake is seen as a real turn-off because it's not to do with, quality of life, even though they will like some of the things that growth enables you to pay for.
It's not even a message that works for the further reaches of the right within Labour, right? So there's some really interesting reporting this week in Politics Home by Sienna Rogers and a colleague whose name I can't remember off the top of my head about a new emergent blue Labour group within Labour that's trying to kind of revive that socially conservative but left-wing economic trend as a way to kind of see off reform. And they're also, it's not about, they're not talking about growth in general. They're trying to talk about growth to a very specific sort of demographic. I wondered though, what you think about that sort of trend within Labour. I mean, it seems like the party's instincts, obviously that's a small group within the party, but it seems like the party's main instinct is, rather than appeal to that big coalition you just mentioned of centre left, is to kind of focus on those seats, whatever it is, 89 seats where reform is in second place, and they might lose to them. And that just seems like a bit of a short-sighted strategy in many ways, because it's so focused on this very tactical issue, but it really risks the wider coalition.
I mean, the thing is, with political strategists, they're always brilliant until they stop being brilliant, right? If you're winning, you're seen as you're brilliant, and then you lose. And like Morgan McSweeney, the right-hand man of Keir Starmer, previously ran the catastrophic run for the leadership of Liz Kendall in 2015. I can't remember, but it was in single digits, the vote share she got as a kind of out and out, let's get back to Blairism and not do any of this revisionist stuff candidate. And then he kind of went underground, and then he resurfaced like with Keir Starmer on this journey, and it worked brilliantly, So he had a terrible result, and then he's had a brilliant result of a 200 majority or whatever that he was aiming for. And then if it stops working, people will say it was always wrong all the way around. It's a bit like football where you get the commentary and it sort of goes, in that second, so as soon as someone's 1-0 down, they just say, there's been a real lack of aggression on the part of Queen's Park Rangers or whatever. And it's just rationalisation of the result that we've seen. And it will be the same when it goes wrong. It'll be the same in Labour. But I mean, his Morgan McSweeney and his analysis has earned his kind of dominance. He targeted the right places. He's done it once, so he can do it again. But that isn't necessarily true. People who are sick of things and wanted a change last time, and what they really want to do is to create Britain in 1975. Do you know what I mean? Like nostalgic older voters, they're not necessarily inspired by growth. And this is where I think you get the disjoint, because Morgan McSweeney's got his thing about where you target. It's worked for Keir, so Keir now likes it. But the way that Keir and probably Rachel Reeves think about it is they're thinking of it like managers, like civil servants, like we need growth because growth will make all our fiscal sums easier to add up, which they're absolutely right about, okay? Which is why I'm not anti-growth. I think we do need growth. But they talk, and let's talk about it in a way that won't scare anyone off. But, it won't work as well as it should. It won't work in some places. Even if it does work, it will lead to some shops closing at the same time that other ones open up. Keir Starmer sometimes says in speeches, we're going to get, cranes building new things in your town or wherever you are across the country. And you think, is that what those kind of nostalgic Brexit voters want? They want things to stay the same and have their roads mended. Do you know what I mean? And so you've got this weird thing where they've taken their judgment that has been right for the moment but could go wrong about who they're targeting, and then they think that the way to talk to them is in a very technocratic, here's what we do to fix the problems, assuming that the voters are empathising with the dilemmas of the rulers to an extent that I really don't think they are.
Tom, so if Labour is contesting kind of a fight that's more on the right and the centre-right politically, what opportunity do you think there is for the Greens, who did better than they ever have done before in the last election, to to make gains, or do you think the fight is on the right and the Greens' fortunes are not necessarily kind of looking super positive either? What do you think will happen in that space?
I think if Labour continues, I think it's open and it's in play. But if Labour continues with what even people kind of close to the sort of Starmer way of thinking are saying now is an ongoing campaign of disdain for the soft left of the Labour Party, then there will be acres of space, like, to the left, and it will get filled one way or another. You know, like they might, if they continue to keep out John McDonnell for speaking up on the winter fuel thing, you know, where the government had a good technocratic point, but like most of the Labour MPs don't agree, and for speaking up on Israel. If they continue to kind of like say there's no place for you within our tent to people who are on that side of things, then one way or another a political vehicle will emerge. And it will be probably a disaster because it will probably get, you know, the Greens might get 5% more votes and still end up with 6 MPs instead of 4. The Jeremy Corbyn thing might get 3% more votes and end up with 4 more MPs, and Labour will lose 120 MPs in the process. So, like, you know, it's a kind of while we've got this voting system, like these in spats within the left are very capable of disabling, you know, both the Labour side and the other side at the same time, which of course is what has happened to the Conservatives, which is why, you know, with reform, which is why Labour did so well last time. So that sort of dynamic can go into reverse, and the way to deal with it is to allow for a slightly broader tent.
So, Tom, you mentioned there the Jeremy Corbyn vehicle. Just for our listeners who might not be familiar, you're referring to the 5 independent MPs that are the won seats, the highest number of independent MPs ever to win seats in Parliament in the last election. Or were you referring to something else, something that might be set up by him as an independent?
So, I mean, I don't follow these things super closely, but Jeremy Corbyn has got a thing he's invented called the Peace and Justice Project. He's also formed a mini group with MPs who were elected, mostly Muslim independent MPs, in protest about the situation in Gaza last year, of whom there's 4 or 5, and they're sitting as a little block. And what I'm talking about is either there could be more MPs, probably on a different range of subjects, on the hard left. I'm sure that group doesn't cohere very well at the moment. Or if we make these, if Labour makes these exclusions from for the likes of John McDonnell on other issues permanent, then you could have the Peace and Justice Project and these groups of MPs and some new block of MPs all merge, and it would start to become a party. You know, you just call it a Socialist Party or whatever. And I think that could be a real threat to Labour's vote share, as could the Greens with a different part of the electorate.
So we've got local elections coming up in May. What's that looking like for Labour? Is that going to be a dicey one for Starmer?
Well, the interesting thing is, I think Starmer will get through these coming local elections fine for a couple of reasons. One is the last time these were contested was 2021, when Boris Johnson was on his COVID bounce. So there's not Labour councillors elected, and Labour's not going to lose loads of councillors. And it's always losses that make the headlines. And for another thing, it's very hard to keep track these days of where local government borders are, but there's still some of these are what we call the Shire county councils, where the Conservatives and to some extent the Liberal Democrats have always been more important. The one I think this year is going to be a crunch election for the Conservatives. If they fall behind in the projected vote reform or something like that, that would be a real crisis point for Kemi Badenoch. And whilst there's a fight going on over there, people won't focus in the same way on Labour. But when you get to next year's local elections, and particularly the year after, then I think it's going to be a different story. The 2027 local elections will be counts that were previously done in, in the aftermath of Liz Truss. And even next year's, by 2022, Labour was, Boris Johnson was on the way out and Labour was doing quite well. Crucially, next year as well, we've got Holyrood up for election. And one of the great things that Starmer has achieved, and the Labour Party thinks it's achieved, is becoming competitive in Scotland, outdoing the SNP at Westminster. And so it's kind of assuming that it will win again in Holyrood, but the polls I've seen so far suggest the opposite is true. And I think that will be a real moment of reckoning. So losses in England and not the expected victory in Holyrood. So I think, we've got another year of this mush before it becomes a kind of political crisis for Keir Starmer.
Great, Tom, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really helpful. And we will make sure to put a link to your piece about how the current Starmer has turned away from the young Starmer who used to be there. We'll put a link to that in the description so people can go and check it out. But thanks very much. It's been great to see you. This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.